Hi everybody. So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about soil characteristics. So how can we describe different properties of soil and how do those properties contribute to what we would think of as healthy soil or soil that's better for growing various plants? This is really important because our next unit we're going to talk about agriculture, and a lot of that is going to hinge on how healthy or how degraded our soils are. Okay, so first thing I just want to point out, if we look at this picture, what we're thinking about when we talk about soils is how well do plants grow in them. So we're thinking here's a plant and here's its root system. So the plant has to be able to have access to water and easily get that water from the soil. It has to have access to nutrients, and two of our main nutrients are going to be nitrogen and phosphorus. Right? It has to be able to grow through the soil, so it has to be loose enough so that those roots can penetrate. So these are some things that we're going to think about is how much organic matter is in the soil, because that's going to influence these properties. How much nutrients are in the soil and how easily does that soil hold on to the nutrients? What does the soil structure and texture look like? And then how well does that soil retain the needed water, but still allow water to pass through? Okay, so that's kind of the summary of where we're going. Here is sort of a list of the soil properties we're going to talk about. So we take into account all of these when talking about the quality of the soil or what type of soil we have. So color, that's pretty straightforward. And I'll show you a slide of that in a minute. Texture, so what does it feel like? Is it gritty? Is it smooth? And a lot of this is determined by the size of the particles. Structure, is it clumpy? Is it evenly distributed? What does it look like? pH, is it acidic or alkaline? So remember, alkaline is another word for basic. So does it have a lot of hydrogen ions or is it very basic? And then, as I said, how many nutrients does it have? And what is the ability of the soil to hold on to those nutrients? And we'll talk about the cation exchange capacity of the soil. That's the CEC. How well does it hold on to water? And how permeable is it to water? So these are kind of opposite sides of the same coin. We want water to be able to go through the soil, but the soil needs to hold on to that water so that when we don't have a lot of rain, the soil still has water that's available for the plants. And both of those things are affected by the porosity of the soil. Okay, so let's just do a quick slide on soil color. So this was actually from the soil lab we did last year. So I have Perry Hall soil. I have soil from Salisbury, Maryland, and soil from Ocean City, Maryland. And as you can see, they actually look quite different. You can see just from this picture, this Salisbury soil is the lightest in color. All right, and generally what we're going to think about with color is that we want black or dark brown soil. That's going to indicate that it's rich in organic materials. So as things like plant leaves fall or plants die or there's debris that is organic, that's going to start breaking down and integrate with the soil. And that sort of partially broken down organic debris is called humus. So we want soils that have a little bit higher quantity of humus are generally thought of as better soils. Now the interesting thing about this picture is Perry Hall is kind of in the middle. Salisbury looks pretty light colored, so this is a really sandy soil, and that kind of makes sense. This is on the eastern shore. The one that doesn't quite make sense to me is this Ocean City, Maryland soil. So why is this the darker of the three? You would think, well, if Salisbury on the eastern shore looks like this, I would expect Ocean City to be very similar just because it's sort of near the beach, right? You wouldn't expect a lot of organic material. This was taken from a new development, so we'd have to do some further research. Was soil added maybe to make trees grow or a garden grow, or is there something specific about this location where the soil was taken? But that was kind of interesting. All right, the next thing we want to talk about is texture. So texture is determined by the size of the particles, and we relate these as having three main types of particles that make up soil. Clay, which is the smallest, silt, which is intermediate, and sand, which is the largest. And obviously within these categories, like sand, you're going to have very different sizes. But these are the three main categories. And you may even just think this from already what you know is you don't want a soil that's all sand, right? Water's going to run right through it. And you probably don't want one that's all clay. So loam is soil that has a more or less even mixture, and we consider that sort of the best soil. All right, and as we look at this, large particles, so soil that has more sand in it, is going to be more porous. And so if it's a sandy soil, that's going to require either more rain or more irrigation. If you have small particles, so if you have a soil that's more clay, if you've ever worked or sculpted with clay, right, it packs closely together, and that's going to make it difficult for water and air to pass through. So it can become waterlogged more easily, and the water, since it doesn't pass through, could actually wind up drowning the roots. So you need some combination of these to actually make the best soils. So how do we determine how much of each of those is present in a soil? So we use this soil triangle to help us categorize the types of soils based on the percent of each of those three substances. So if you look at this, we have percent clay, percent silt, and percent sand. And you can see by these pictures are giving you sort of the relative sizes. So clay is very small, so 2/1000ths of a millimeter. Silt is intermediate, and then sand is up to 2 millimeters in size. So these are very large particles, okay? And the way we use the soil triangle is first you start out on the clay side. So that was the side on the left, and you're going to go straight across there. And then the silt is on the right. You go diagonally down from the silt and then diagonally up from the clay. And where those lines intersect is the type of soil you have. All right, so let's do an example. So what is the texture of soil that is 30% clay, 30% silt, and 40% sand? So the first thing we do is start with clay, and here's our 30%. So we're going to go horizontally straight across on this line, if I can sort of draw it where the line is. And then 30% silt, so our silt is on the right-hand side, and we're going to go diagonally down. So here's our 30% line there. And then 40% sand. Sand is on the bottom. We're going to come up from the bottom. And those three lines intersect, and we have clay loam type of soil. Okay, so describing what type of soil gives you some indication of what the properties of that soil might be and what kind of things you would take into account if you're trying to grow crops in that area. All right, so you might be asking yourself, well, okay, we need to know the percents of each of these. How do we figure out? So you can take soil samples, and these are very, very high tech, all right, not really, very low tech ways to do it. But you basically collect your soil, you dry it out, and you get rid of all the clumps so it's even in consistency, and you find a jar or a graduated cylinder or basically anything, and you add water. So you start out at about half soil, half water, you shake it up really well, and then you let it settle out. So if you think about this, the sand, which are the biggest particles, they're going to settle out first, followed by the silt, followed by the clay. And then if you look, here's the one in the bottom. You can really see in this picture the difference in the three layers. All right, so you've got the sand layer on the bottom, right, silt in the middle, and clay in this case is a thin layer on top. All right, this is an example over here on the left of one we did last year in lab. And this soil is a little bit harder to tell, but you can probably see on the bottom, this looks a little sandier. So this black mark here is dividing the sand from the silt. And then the clay is actually, in this case, forming this light layer on top. All right, and the clay, sometimes you can see in this mason jar over here, the clay takes a while to settle out, sometimes leaving that a little hazy. So what you do is once you have those layers, you just take a ruler and you measure it, and you figure out the percent is the amount of sand compared to the total, or the amount of silt compared to the total, and you figure out your percents of each that way. You can also kind of just get a rough idea just by feeling the texture of it. So mix the soil with a little bit of water so you can kind of form it into a ball. And again, think about clay. If you do this with clay, that's why we use it in our class, you can mold it into anything you want. So this is an example of a soil that has a lot of clay content because it can be molded into this ribbon fairly easily. If you had a soil that had more sand content, you wouldn't be able to form this ribbon, okay? The other thing is soils that have lots of clay in them will be smoother, whereas sand is obviously going to be grittier. So those are some ways that you can kind of determine what might be present in your soil. All right, so that's the texture. So thinking about the different sizes of the particles. We also want to know something about the pH. So let's just, before we get into this, do a quick reminder of what pH is. So remember, pH is the negative log of hydrogen ion concentration, or hydrogen ions are also protons, so I will probably use those interchangeably. So when we look at the pH scale, again, let's see if I can draw. I cannot draw a straight line on this, but you get the idea. So pH is going to go from 1 to 14. All right, 7 is right in the middle, and so 7 is what we term neutral pH. If we're below 7, it's acidic. And if it's above 7, we consider it basic or alkaline, okay? One of the things, again, don't get confused, is low pH, because of this equation, low pH actually means high hydrogen ion concentration. So the lower the pH, the more hydrogen ions are in solution. The higher the pH, the less protons you have. And if you remember from chemistry, the more OH or hydroxide ions you have. But biology, we mostly pay attention to these hydrogen ions. Okay, so does that ring a bell? So now if we look at the pH of the soil, again, like most things in biology, we kind of want around neutral pH. So the pH of the soil is going to influence the availability of nutrients. So if the soil is too acidic, it can cause heavy metals to leach into groundwater. So these heavy metals tend to form cations. And so when they stick to the soil, if you have too much acid, too much hydrogen ions, these positive hydrogen ions bump the heavy metals out of the soil basically, and then they can leach and go through the soil and into the groundwater, okay? Whether a soil is acidic or basic really depends on a whole bunch of factors. So how did the soil actually form? What types of plants grow there? How much decomposition there is? We tend to have kind of slightly acidic soil in this area. And it's measured basically by using just a pH soil test. So you basically take a sample of your soil, you shake it with some water, sometimes you let it sit for a certain amount of time, and then you add whatever the pH indicator is, and you see what matches. So it looks like to me, this is a little bit of a basic soil or an alkaline soil. All right. In addition to pH, we can also do very similar tests to look at the nutrients that a soil might have. So plants need some nutrients in higher quantities, and these are referred to as macronutrients. And that can be nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. These are the three that are most commonly found, like in fertilizers that you add to the soil. But it also includes calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And just as a reminder, calcium and magnesium are going to form cations, and so is potassium for that matter. And then they also need carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? We all do for growth. So that's going to come from water, and obviously plants fix carbon dioxide in photosynthesis. Nitrogen, you may remember from, or hopefully you remember, when we talked about the nitrogen cycle, 80% of the Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen, but plants can't access that atmospheric nitrogen, which is N2. So you need some way to fix the nitrogen or make it into a more usable form. And so one way to do that is certain plants actually have symbiotic bacteria that work with the roots, and they fix nitrogen. So soybeans, alfalfa, clover, peanuts are all examples of plants that are nitrogen fixers. And it's not the plant, it's actually the bacteria that's associated with it. And then other plants, they get their nitrogen either through decomposition of organic matter. So bacteria can break down dead material, or you can add fertilizers if you're a farmer. All right, phosphorus, you may remember, again, here's that phosphorus cycle that weathers slowly out of rock. It's also found in guano, which is basically bird poop. So we actually mine for phosphorus in order to add it to our fertilizers. All right, so how do we check for these? And again, as I said, the most common nutrients that you're going to add to the soil or you're going to want to know about are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so these are the things that you're going to find in fertilizers. If you look at a bag of fertilizer, it'll tell you the percents of each of these. And they're also the nutrients that you can test for the most easily. And you can buy these actually in a garden store. This is one of the most common ones. There's a lot of different types of tests, but they all basically work the same way. Again, sometimes you mix the soil with water, you let it sit for a certain amount of time so that the nutrients dissolve in the water, and then you add in whatever indicator chemical you need for that test, and then it's usually a color match. And some tests are more sensitive than others, but it's pretty common for them to give you like high, medium, low, trace for your amounts of each. Okay. The other thing we want to know, so we want to know how many nutrients are in the soil, but we also want to know is how well does the soil hold on to those nutrients? Do they get washed through, or does that soil hold on to those nutrients for a longer time? So the ability to do that is based in large part on this cation exchange capacity. So remember, cations are positive ions. And just in previous slides, remember we talked about potassium, calcium, magnesium. So a lot of our nutrients are going to be positively charged. So if the soil has negative charges on it, so if there's our soil particle, then the positive charges are going to basically bind to that soil, and the soil can hold on to those more easily if they have these negative binding. Okay, so soil particle surfaces that are negatively charged hold cations, and then what happens is the plant roots can donate protons, so they donate hydrogen ions. So again, here's our positive charge, so that hydrogen ion can then bump off the nutrient, and then the plant can take up the nutrient in exchange. So that's our cation exchange capacity. This is a measure of soil fertility. Clay and organic matter are going to have the greatest cation exchange capacity. All right. In addition to the type of material, if the soil has a low pH, so again, low pH means it already has lots of hydrogen ions, the cation exchange capacity is going to diminish because all of these spots are going to be full with those protons already, and the nutrients, instead of staying in the soil, are going to be washed away, or we say that they're leached away. So they dissolve in the water and they keep basically going through the soil. So how can we test for this? So here's a pretty easy way to do it. We're going to take advantage of two stains, Crystal Violet and Eosin Y. So Crystal Violet's like a purplish stain. This is like a reddish yellow stain. And Crystal Violet is actually positively charged, and eosin is negative. So these are both going to sort of mimic nutrients. So we're going to use these to model how nutrients move through the soil. So you basically set up, here's sand, for instance, we're going to test. And this is just, there's a little hole in the bottom of this conical shaped tube. We can plug it with a little cotton so the sand doesn't fall through. And then we're going to add our dye to the top layer. And then we're going to start dropping in water. And we're going to see what comes out the bottom of this tube. So if this material is good at holding on to the crystal violet, in other words, if there's lots of negative charges in here, then think about it. What would you expect? The water will wash through and it won't pull off the crystal violet. If, on the other hand, there aren't any charges on this substance, then as the water hits the crystal violet, it's going to mix and you'll get purple color coming out the bottom. Does that make sense? And the same similar thing happens with eosin depending on how many positive charges there are. All right, so let's look at some examples of this. So here was a setup we did last year. So CV stands for crystal violet. The numbers tell you how many mils of water were added before we started seeing color come out, okay? So when we just used sand, it only took 6 mils of water, and look, we got nice dark crystal violet coming out. So sand is going to have a low cation exchange capacity. Whereas when we mix it with some clay, now look, it took 15 milliliters, and I don't know if you can see, but in the bottom here, this is our water layer. It's almost perfectly clear. So adding that clay increased our cation exchange ability, okay? Now, this is the primary one that we're concerned about. So clay and organic material tends to have a lot of negative charges, but we can look at the opposite. And you can see a difference in the eosin. So the eosin is a little darker colored here than here, but it's not quite the same as you see with the crystal violet. All right, so that's just looking at clay and then sand. So what if we look at real soil? So we know here's our comparison. So here was our soil sample. So here's our crystal violet. So I would say that's pretty good. We have a pretty high cation exchange capacity. And if we look at anions, as we would expect, more of these are going to go through. Okay, I hope that made sense. All right. What about water holding capacity? So we talked about nutrients. How well does the soil hold on to water? So how often do we have to water it or irrigate our crops? So if soil particles are small and compacted, so think clay, the soil will be able to hold more water, but it takes longer for the water to drain in the soil. All right, looser, larger particles make the soil more permeable, but less able to retain water. So this is kind of like the Goldilocks effects. You want water to go through a little bit, but not too much. And you want it to be able, the soil to be able to hold water, but not for too long so that it just gets clogged with water, so to speak. Okay? And so you can test this also very easily. So here's sort of an easy setup where we just take a column, we put cheesecloth on one end, again, that's just to hold the soil in, and you basically add water, and you see how quickly water comes out the other side. All right, here's a little fancier setup where you take funnels and you're going to add, in this case, they added the same amount of gravel, light soil, sand, and clay to each funnel. And then they added water and saw how much in each case flows through. So you can time it, so you can see how long it takes, and then you can see how much comes through. And so you can actually determine what the flow rate is by using those two figures. Okay, and we can see right away, and this makes perfect sense, gravel, you add water, it's going to basically run right through, and we have a lot of water. Clay, the water gets caught up, so it's not very permeable, and so we only have a little bit of water in the bottom of the clay one. Okay, so that's the permeability of the soil. And then how much can it hold? So the water holding capacity is a measurement of how much volume of water a soil sample can hold. So to measure this, you saturate the soil. So you can take your sample from your percolation test, which is the one we just did. So it percolates, the water percolates through. You can take that because that's been saturated, and you compare the dry mass. So here's the dry mass over here to the wet mass. All right, and this difference is how much that particular amount of soil can hold. And you can write that as a percent by doing wet mass minus dry mass. So that gives you the difference. That gives you the amount of water over the dry mass times 100. And that will tell you how much water that particular sample can hold. And you can think to yourself, if we were to compare sand and clay, sand probably not going to hold too much, right? It's going to run through. Clay, while it's not very permeable, once clay does get saturated, it's going to hold that water for a long time, and it's going to be better able to conserve that water. All right, we're getting towards the end, so I thought I would just put this in. So a lot of the things we've talked about as far as characteristics of soil really come down to the soil components. So this is kind of a chart that sums up some of these properties. So if you have a lot of clay, you're going to have poor water infiltration, good water holding capacity, good nutrient capacity, poor aeration. All right, so the soil is going to become more compact, and so those roots aren't going to have enough oxygen maybe. And the workability of it is going to be poor. Think of trying to like plant plants in like clay, all right? If you look at sand, we kind of have almost the opposite. Excellent water infiltration, poor water and nutrient holding, good aeration, pretty easy to work with. Right? Silt's kind of the medium of those two things. And then we can see what organic matter adds. So organic matter is really going to be good for a lot of these categories as it adds nutrient holding, water holding capacity, and adds a little bit of water infiltration again. So you can probably make an argument now really to understand why loam is sort of the better, what we think of as the better soil, because loam contains pretty much equal or roughly equal amounts of all of these. So we get, by mixing them together, sort of the best overall quality. Okay.